Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 7th episode of Retuning Your Firm. We've got three quite interesting themes today. What clients want from their advisors, and we'll be hearing from a general counsel who, as you'd know, if you're in the legal world, is a client. The idea of how professional firms go around fundraising and M&A for themselves, as opposed to helping clients. And then finally, let's have a sort of look at the financial health of the sector, because let's face it, the one person that your finance director will probably confide in, or should, is going to be their banker. So who's on the call today? Who's on the panel? First of all, I'd like to welcome Dan Kayne, who is the General Counsel, Regional Businesses for Network Rail. As some of you will be aware, Network Rail had a very unfortunate accident a week or so ago, and Dan has obviously been very much involved in that, so we're delighted that he's found some time to join us today, despite a very busy week. Secondly, John Llewellyn-Lloyd, who is the Director of Corporate Finance of Arden, and is probably the go-to person for when most law and accountancy firms are thinking about either going public or raising debt finance or something other than banking. Nick Bailey, who is the other person that people go to. In his case, he works for Santander, and he is the Relationship Director with specific focus on professional services. So I think that gives us quite an interesting, quite a sort of, what shall I say, client-focused and finance-focused session today. And then Francesca, who is always with her new puppy, breath of fresh air, and looking forward to her perspectives very much from possibly the larger firm perspective, and the extent to which some of these issues can make management harder when you're dealing with that size of firm. And yours truly, obviously, is the founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum, and this is actually, in fact, our 22nd such of these Friday morning shows, as you all seem to want to call it, which is fine by me now. And I'm really happy that we're here sort of again on a busy day in August for some of us, others happily on holiday, but a nice number of people have joined us today, which is awesome. So what are we doing? We're not just doing something normal, we're also doing something completely different. So at 11 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, apologies, we're going to be, hopefully some of you join us in Remo, which is our new informal networking. And as of next week, members will be interested here. We are going to be running what we call member time, so that for 3 slots of 20 minutes, you can go in and then share thoughts with something that's keeping you awake at night with a fellow member in a very nice, informal, relaxed place. So you'll get a note about that shortly. So what do we talk about on this show for those of you who haven't been actually on the show before? A couple of things. First of all, think big. Believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. That's Lewis Carroll, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And remember that you are the power of your relationships, but that reciprocity is actually fundamental to any relationship. If you run a vacuum cleaner, you'll get an obvious result. You've got to think small, particularly in the current marketplace. Think about angles that actually resonate with your key audiences. That could be an internal audience, it could be a client audience, it could even be a banker maybe, but just focus on things that are really going to make a difference to those audiences. Think about doing campaigns rather than one-offs. Think about how you can bring your clients or your people into a real community, particularly if they're isolated at home. Drop the convention. You have to go for some new ideas and services. Now, about back in May, everybody said, oh, we're going to change our business model. Then they kind of thought, that's a bit complicated, maybe not. So the focus is back on strategy and clarity, but do think about new ideas and services. Speed is of the essence. A lot of things have happened. A lot of people have said we've done 3 years of development in 3 months. That may be true of your technological infrastructure, but is it as true of the way you go to market? Possibly not. So think about what assumptions underlie your approach to the market, articulate them, and that's easy for accountants, perhaps less normal for people from other professional bodies, professional spaces. And if those assumptions prove invalid, and they will, a bit like any experiment, all scientists will tell you that most experiments fail, it's normal. But if you won't use the word invalid, it depersonalizes it, then amend them and pivot in a new direction. And if you want to explore that a bit more, it's often called lean start. And finally, be entrepreneurial. We actually are, as a sector, I think, quite entrepreneurial. But I think a lot of people think about entrepreneurs in terms of the innovation piece rather than the listening bit. And I always say that if you're not listening to your clients, it's somewhat unlikely that you will then be in alignment with their needs. You may be lucky, but why take that chance? And that's adapted from Elena Kudsko of Globsec in Bratislava back in April. And that was very perspective. We're now August, and that's still really good advice back in April. So really great insights there. So thank you very much to Elena. So let's look quickly at last week's poll. If you recall, for those of you who are on the show, we looked at learning and development, and I'm just going to pull out 3 from the set of slides. They're all in the management library, obviously. But this idea that learning and development strategy is developed and implemented at a firm, it looks to me as though most people are saying it's kind of not really happening at a more sort of strategic level, particularly at the early stages. So it's kind of an afterthought. Okay, let's go and do some training. And as we all know, training is not the best way to bring about behavior change. Much better to understand what the behavior is that's leading to the issue. And then having identified that, then maybe training is part of the answer, but equally it could be poor management. And there's a lot of people who argue that poor management is usually a bigger cause for problems than a lack of training. But if in doubt, send them on a training course. We all know that. What about get the data that's gathered and analyzed in relation to learning programs? Again, very, very few people are actually using data and analytics, designing into the program, even mashing that with KPIs. Most people are in the sort of more efficiency space, or possibly just the happy sheet, as it's so called. And then lastly, about performance diagnostics, the extent to which what's causing this gap between current and desired performance. And a few conversations are taking place, but very little really sort of what I call serious analysis going on in terms of, is this learning initiative really going to add value to the business and really help the people involved or not? Or is it just knee-jerk, oh, send them on a training course? Anyway, the other questions, again, you will find in the management library as usual, but I just pulled those 3 out, so they're quite interesting. So as you all know, or for those of you who have been on the show before, the feedback from UK government is that our results are incredibly valuable in their analysis. And I know that because the other day I was 1 day late and they said, where is it? And to me, that's a pretty good feedback that people are interested in what you're doing. So thank you for that, which is a bit of a precursor, I guess, to today's poll. What's going on at the moment is there really is a changing landscape. And the next generation of advisors are going to need a set of skills that can be applied in many different contexts. Emotional intelligence is the subplot here, I suspect. But it's not just a question of going on a training course. It's actually formally training people, but then sustaining it throughout the career. And this links in with, as some of you may be aware, next year, the solicitors, the lawyers, training will be changing, and this is part of the input into that process from a group which Dan has been very much on the call today, been driving, along with another 15 or so GCs. And the key drivers, the key categories that they identified was to be adaptable, to build relationships, and also to create value through projects. So what we've done today is we've taken 10 of the sort of key attributes that we feel that are something that is really going to be matter to clients. And Dan, as I mentioned before, is a client, is a general counsel. And what are the things that actually your advisors, and I appreciate, because most of you are leaders, you can't necessarily answer for yourself, but only for the perception of your people. But to what extent when dealing with clients, to what extent are your advisors exhibiting these behaviors? And please be honest, think about what's actually happening rather than the surface veneer or what you think should be happening. And rather than thinking there was sort of some sort of scientific thing, we'll have a poll, obviously. They are really a trigger for thinking. So going back to the first one, which is about taking action in the face of fear or uncertainty. And remember, this is when dealing with clients. People may be dealing differently with employees or with other audiences, but we're dealing here very much with clients. So to what extent do they take action in the face of fear or uncertainty? Sometimes, I think, is probably the one that comes out strongest there. When recovering quickly from disappointment, resilience, if you like, that's a little bit more, that's normal. So about 2/3 think that's normal. And again, this is on average for all advisors. I appreciate there will always be outliers. In terms of seeking out information to identify areas for improvement, again, pretty much evenly spread across that one. 3% almost never, quite a small percentage. But the others, no real clear winner on that one, if you like. When it then comes to applying new skills, techniques, and information to practice, only 50% it sometimes, and consistent is really quite low, just sort of 15% on that one. And again, nearly 10% almost never. I didn't put never in. I thought that was a bit absolute, but almost never was kind of a nice sort of in-between space. What about understanding perspectives and agendas of other people? Again, that's normally and consistently is getting on for 70% there. So I guess that one is seen to be perhaps less of an issue, the empathy, if you like, sometimes described as. What about when people delivering the right message to a given audience, their comms skills? Again, something like, oh gosh, getting on for 80%, think that's consistent or normal. We'll hear from Dan whether he thinks that's realistic assessment or whether that's the managing partner thinks it's something, but the people on the ground have a different perspective. That's always an interesting issue to chat about. What about then moving on to number 7, to working with people both in the short and the long term? And again, 80% consistently and normally, not so many in the lower spaces. In terms of seeing business opportunities in the face of challenges, now that one clearly is a little bit lower down, with the biggest item being just sometimes. In final, let's see, moving 2 more to go, yeah. In terms of, we have dead heat on the one to do with finding the optimal solution to a given business opportunity or challenge, with not very many people seeing that one being done consistently. And in terms of an ability to sort of distill the most important elements into an easy to understand form, which is obviously critical for lawyers, but actually is very, very relevant for very other advisors as well, given that you do bring a huge amount of expertise into your conversations with clients. And again, most people getting on for 80% think that's consistent or normal. So that's my quick sort of rundown of the results, just to give Dan a few minutes to collect his thoughts on what they might be telling him as somebody who's, if you like, knows these questions much better than I do, having effectively set them. And I'll now stop sharing and invite Dan to come and give us his 5 minutes of thoughts.
So thank you for participating in that. Let me give you a bit of context as to where that's come from. So thank you for the introduction as well, Richard. So I first started looking at skills of lawyers in particular, but I think, and I'm looking forward to hearing whether others think, that this applies across all professional services. I was hiring someone into my team and started looking at the kind of people that we were getting, particularly from private practice coming into the in-house legal environment, and saw a very heavily weighted focus on technical excellence and insufficient focus on behavioral or people skills. And that made it very difficult to hire someone that I felt confident would be able to hit the ground running when I brought them into the team. So I started socializing this idea with a number of my GC network, and it became clear that others faced very similar experiences when dealing with their advisors, that the technical excellence was almost a given, but it was a very transactional type of relationship. And within the profession at the moment, we see a lot of talk around strategic partnerships. And I think, quite frankly, it's a veneer rather than a reality. And once you scratch away at the surface, you recognize that the kind of skills and attributes that we've just been looking at are plainly not evident on a regular basis. And so we asked a number of GCs, general counsel. We went out to 18 leading general counsel and did interviews with them. And those interviews is what we ended up bringing together to produce actually what were 12 attributes, and 10 of which you've answered questions on. So those attributes are those that we asked a broad community of FTSE 250 GCs on. And so we eventually created a program around this, the O-shaped lawyer or O-shaped leader, if we're looking at wider profession. And there's more of that and the GC report available on our website. But what we did was took that into law firms and started saying to them, as clients, we are saying that the 3 elements that come out of that report are that technical advice is a given, that law firms who want to stand out not only therefore need to be great at doing that, we expect that, need to also be able to understand fundamentally what our business and industry sectors are about. And I think, again, that's quite commonly known. And the third one that was mentioned there is about saying that GCs were asking for their advisors to also demonstrate that they can create value for the business. And that's going a bit further than most of the law firms we'd worked with had anticipated. And not surprising why we see possibly the outlier of results is around this ability to create opportunities for their clients. And so what we see quite often, and was, I think, re-emphasized by the 18 or so GCs that we met, and many more we've spoken to, is that this idea of going into the business and creating value is very rare. What we do see a lot of is great technical expertise. And so this group that I started and is really starting to get traction in the legal profession was looking at why is that the case? And we focus quite heavily on what people might term soft skills. Frankly, they're the hardest ones to try and deliver against. But we saw there was a real lack of training and development around the formation of lawyers, and the focus from all the way through education to leadership at law firms, largely law firms, was a real focus on technical excellence and very little on what I would say is leadership development. So many people who reach leadership positions have never had any formal leadership development training. And so what we find, particularly in the legal profession, and really interested again to hear this is more broad, that as the technically best lawyers who bring in the most fees get promoted to the leadership positions, they then start to recruit and hire in their own image, and those that are successful continue to embody the kind of skills, the technical skills that are regarded with such high capital at professional services firms. But from a client perspective, what that means is we lose out on that very human relationship, that ability to create value through building trust and relationships between advisors and clients. And that's why I think as a client, this idea of a strategic partnership is great in essence, but there's a huge amount of work that needs to go in to truly develop what I think remains largely transactional, and I'm talking in very general terms, and not sufficiently in terms of a relationship where the partners, genuinely the partners of client and law firm, come together as one to deliver a great service to the end user. So to try and kind of conclude a little bit of what we're getting to here, as a client, I don't necessarily feel like I get that kind of service. And for lawyers to start talking about feeling is almost unheard of. And what we've created, I think, in our environment is what I read, and I think is a great summary of what I think will be a successful lawyer in the future when we talk about skills, is not just the smarts, the IQ, but the smarts and hearts, those who have got both the IQ and the EQ, which I think people are starting to recognize is just as valuable to great advisors to their clients as the IQ. And so what we've pushed very hard as our group in terms of this O-shaped lawyer group is trying to really transform legal education to bring in these skill sets very early on in development and formation of the professionals. So it almost becomes part of their DNA as they go through the system, that these competencies become part of their service delivery, and that the profession and our professions are truly regarded as service providers, not knowledge providers. And there's a distinct difference, I think, between the two. So I think looking at the whole system, when I look at it from a client perspective, I want to feel like that firm, that provider has got my back. And at the moment, I see great transactional support, I see fabulous technical support, but I don't feel like a valued customer. And that, I think, is what our program is about and what I'd be really interested to hear from others about.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. And in a way, your point about leadership is really important because people tend to copy the behaviors of their leaders. So whilst you can put them on a training course, they go back to the ranch and, oh, that's the way we do things around here. I better copy that. John, you're kind of come and give us a little bit of insight now, but the leadership and management is a very interesting segue because, of course, from the investor's point of view, how well the firm is managed and the extent to which they recognize the value inherent in that firm is pretty critical. So do you want to come and give us 5 minutes, John? Just again, John, as I mentioned, is a sort of has been working in investment management, investment banking, corporate finance for many years, both in an advisor role, but also in leadership roles within those organizations, which are themselves professional services firms. So John, over to you, sir.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Hopefully I've managed to unmute everything so everyone can hear me. Often a common problem I have on these things. I think really my thought is very much a sort of a fundraiser and sort of, if you like, advisor, M&A advisor to law firms. Interesting sort of segue from what Dan was saying is I think the first themes, the industry themes that I see across the whole marketplace at the moment are massive changes and massive issues presenting management teams in law firms, all professional firms. And I think those come back to firms on the high street are seeing a metamorphosis in the changes and challenges that are sort of coming through. And there is an enormous amount of consolidation. You're seeing the B2B middle ground, particularly of legal firms, but also of accounting firms, being very challenged. And you either have to be small or very large, whatever that means. So I think, again, there are challenges sort of everywhere on that space. Capital constraints and distress. We're seeing now COVID, I call it a dam of distress is building up across professional services firms. There are definitely going to be some sort of winners and losers. And I think the first quarter of next year, calendar year, will be very instructive in terms of some of the distress opportunities that will be presented to the healthy law firms. And I think then new business skills, new entrants to the market are also the challenges. And last but by no means least, technology. We've talked a lot about remote working. Most of the clients that I have are now completely rethinking their working from home sort of policies. And you've seen some big city institutions now change to those fronts. So I think all management team in legal firms, any firms, are going to see enormous numbers of changes, and they must adapt themselves for those changes. Turning quickly to the investor's point of view, I think investors like corporatized solutions. I think they see corporates as attractive. They tend to have better quality management. That management is more decisive. And actually management is fostered as a core skill within those sorts of firms. So investors in any services firm tend to prefer the sort of corporatized option. I think the other thing about the corporatized firms is they do find it easier, I think, to acquire and make good acquisitions. So again, I think investors are sort of much clearer from the point of view of where that leaves them in terms of having a clear decision-making structure that can raise money, has good financials, etc., etc. So I think that's the sort of the core skills. What does it mean from a management point of view against all of that changes? In my own view, personally, it does mean that for anything other than the very large firms who probably corporatized anyway, the corporatization of a professional services firm is key, and really building management as a core skill alongside obviously the core skills of delivering their business. I think transparency is very important in the modern firms, not consensual management. I think consensual management is a big problem for engineering the gain, the achievements quick enough from that point of view. Financials will have to be at the core. I think 5-year business plans will have to become the norm. And I think forecasting will have to improve quite considerably in some firms of that. And I think technology will be the core of any business. You'll need probably more data analysts than you will sort of technical, if you like, professionals from that point of view. Digital marketing, the concept of Amazon law and all of these sorts of things will become very, very important. And I think last but by no means least is that management will have to present itself as being scalable, because I think a lot of managements are going to have to do more acquisitions now over the next 1 to 2 years than they've ever done in the past. So that's my thoughts. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, John. That was great. And I think, again, this idea of professionalizing management and not being an afterthought and some of the admin department or whatever else it might be called in some other contexts. You also picked up the whole point about forecasts, and I suspect from the banking perspective, getting a range of alternative forecasts, different good scenario, poor scenario, etc., is pretty fundamental to a lot of lending. So I'd like to introduce Nick now, who's, as I mentioned earlier, is the head of professional practice at Santander, director there, to come and talk to a little bit about, from the banking perspective, what do they see as there is this dam of forget the wording you used, John, anyway, a dam anyway, coming towards
distress.
Next year. Thank you very much. Dam of distress, perfect wording. And then also, given that, as I mentioned earlier, probably the finance director is only going to confide in their banker, because if they don't do that, they've got a serious problem. Any insights you have as to the general sort of financial health, cash balances, or whatever it happens to be of the sector as a whole will be interesting. Over to you, Nick.
Richard, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. And yeah, I mean, I will touch on that, and in particular, COVID and COVID financing. I think when you started off these calls, I can't remember now, way back in March potentially, I think we had Chloe Cliff from HSBC talk about some of the government schemes available to professional services firms and companies throughout the country, and they have skyrocketed. But I'll touch on how they've affected professional services. So we had some data from UK Finance last week showing that lenders have helped over 1.2 million businesses through the three major schemes. Over 13 billion has been lent to 58,000 firms through CBILS, and 480 large businesses have been supported through CLIBILS. So some major support there from UK banks, not just Santander, but many of our peers who cover this sector on this call as well. The bounce back scheme, the smallest scheme for the lifeblood of our economy, the SMEs, has been by far the most popular, very quick for banks to process, straight into companies' accounts within 1 week, 2 weeks. And that's where Santander have probably supported the most, approving over 3.4 billion via BBLS, more than double our 4.5% SME market share. And again, we're not alone there. All of the banks have contributed to that. So what are professional services, and how have professional services fared within this sector? And this is where I perhaps have some notes of optimism. For professional services, I mean, each business will be different. No doubt there'll be many leaders on this call covering consultancy, architecture, advertising, and other core sectors that have had far greater challenges than those seen within legal and accountancy sectors. I do feel sorry for some of my colleagues who cover the training businesses, who I must admit have been far busier than I have, and that's where I have notes of optimism. The amount of applications we've had through the government schemes within the professional services sector has been very low, and surprisingly low. And I'll come on to that, and perhaps the adaptability of professional services firms versus other companies. So very few requests, and where we have lent into the sector, it's been what we would term a BAU, a business usual request. Firms looking for additional liquidity, contingency funding, but certainly not emergency funding, certainly not that emergency government funding that those schemes were really set up for. And what that's enabled professional services to do is to actually take on far cheaper funding, funding on far more competitive terms than the government schemes, where margins are often north of 3-4%, depending on the funding that business is looking for. So that's been a positive. And I think one of the other things to touch on is those government schemes placed great restrictions on dividends and in turn distributions, which has been a further challenge to professional services firms, and therefore that ability for banks to look at profs on a BAU basis has been very important. So some signs of optimism from me, and the sector as a whole remains one banks are very keen to lend to. Our internal credit ratings for professional services firms are typically very strong. The default rate within the sector is very low. Our non-performing loan book within professional services again is very low. So, we remain optimistic. Headwinds to come, as I think John said at the start of next year. But professional services firms have been there before. Despite wiping out years of growth, the global financial crisis saw professional services firms come through relatively unscathed. And I think we'll see it again. There will be disruption in the market, as John said, which may well present consolidation opportunities, the consolidation that we perhaps in the legal sector in particular have still not seen, but some room for optimism. And I think one note of caution on those government schemes, and this is a bit of an unknown at the moment. So one for the finance directors and managing partners on the call is the likelihood that we're hearing at the moment is that those schemes will come to an end at the end of September. That hasn't been confirmed, but I suppose the word of warning would be, if you do need support, if you do need to speak to your finance teams to see how the firm is tracking at the moment, then please speak with your banking partners. There should be a key advisor to your firm. COVID has given bankers an opportunity to actually be heard and heard positively, which has been quite welcome. But make sure you're prepared, and forecasting is key. All too often, professional services firms, the forecasting we see as bankers is fairly weak. It forecasts, a year on year of flat growth at most as a stress case. and speak to your financial advisors, other financial advisors, accountancy, legal firms, etc. For those smaller firms who need that help in preparing those forecasts. What else have we seen? Well, cash, and cash is king for all banks, as you well know, and for us, it's what we fixate on, and in particular lockup. And COVID, rather crudely, I suppose, for us bankers, has actually, seen firms accelerate that focus on lockup cash, and we've seen vast improvements. A lot of our largest firms actually sitting on significant levels of cash. Collections have vastly improved. Holdbacks on distributions and indeed drawings on a monthly basis have seen firms sitting on surpluses, and so that, firms, professional services firms, far greater than your trading companies, have that ability through the LLP model, or even the standard corporate model, to turn off those key outflows, people costs, very, very quickly. And so that's been very welcome, and we've seen that in some of the strong forecasts that we have seen come through. And so to Richard's point on one, fine-tuning their business and the model set out by racing cars and those companies in particular, that time spent focusing on cash throughout this crisis, I think, has been invaluable for firms. And I think we really hope that will continue post-COVID and will become a BAU practice. So we'll see how that works. So whilst I start the talk with much optimism, I will end on some notes of caution. And this isn't particular on financing, but it's the financial health of the company. Fraudsters continue to see professional services as a target sector. Whilst most firms have adapted well to new business practices, change brings opportunity for fraudsters. Working at home brings new challenges, with firms having to adapt to the way they make and receive payments, process invoices, and deal with both clients and suppliers. So please, if you need to, speak to your respective banks on how to adapt to that as well. So Richard, thank you very much for having me on. More than happy to answer questions, but I would end on the forecasting piece. Forecasting is key for us. Please speak to your bankers on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And I think, Nick, as you said, I think you were in episode 1, which was 20th of March, would you believe it?
There we go, yeah.
Scary, isn't it? Francesca, welcome for today. And tell us a little bit about what have you been hearing today on the show to date, and what are the issues that you hear emerging from your perspective, both as a leader of Grant Thornton International, but also as somebody who has their ear to the ground with a lot of smaller firms within the Grant Thornton network and elsewhere.
Well, thank you, Richard. Hello, good morning, everybody. That was great, actually, listening to those different things those themes that were being covered, and maybe I can pick up a few different pieces from each of those conversations. I'll start with the things that Dan was talking to around EQ, empathy, and becoming something that's more than a technical specialist, and that really resonates. I don't know if accounting firms are further down the track than legal firms. I suspect that it's probably in a roughly similar place, but a lot of that thinking, which is incredibly powerful, is very much seeped into the accounting profession. And the concept of someone being a little bit more T-shaped. They've got depth, technical expertise, but they've got this ability to think across different areas. So you go in and you may be doing the audit, but you're more empathic with what's happening in the business. You want to be able to talk to clients about what matters to them. So stepping into the shoes of clients and making sure that you aren't just doing that transactional piece is very much part of the training that I think is essential to be a professional advisor. It may also be the reality that you can't answer the thing the client's most interested in, and that's not a problem. If you can go and connect them with someone else within your firm who can provide that insight, or maybe even connect them with another organization that can help them, that's absolutely fine. But it's like everything, isn't it? Your clients care about their business, they're passionate about their business, and if you're not passionate about their business, you're missing the opportunity to add real value to them. So I thought that was all very well thought through, Dan, and hugely important. Technical skill, that's just table stakes. If you can't do the technical bit, you shouldn't be doing the job. It's the extra bit that people really want, and it's hugely important. I was really interested about the M&A piece that John was mentioning. I'm seeing, not just in the UK, but all around the globe, a lot of firms that are both seizing those opportunities, but also a lot of firms that are really struggling. and that consolidation in the market, it could be teams, it could be broader networks, it could be a range of things. The M&A opportunities are huge. I know we're involved in quite a number at the moment, and there were firms that previously probably wouldn't have been open to that level of discussion. So I think we are going to see some real shifts. So it's a hugely positive situation if you are looking to grow your firm in certain areas. One of the things that I think is massively important is that you do want to be in the M&A sphere. You've got to be investor ready yourself. You've got to make sure that you've got the cash, you've got the ability to manage that transaction, you've got your processes in place to do it. And as we all know, you can do M&A and you can do M&A well, and it's all about cultural fit and bringing it together. So hugely important that if those opportunities are going to be available, particularly I think in 2021, I think, John, that's a really valid point. Are you ready to take advantage of it, or you don't want to be scurrying around trying to make that all work? But thinking about it now, hugely important. And the joys of cash is king. I mean, yeah, Nick, it's so lovely to see you again, actually. It seems like yesterday. I can't believe it was that long ago. I've been fascinated to see how good firms have been about getting cash in and the lockup. It's just been extraordinary. I mean, we've got 131 firms, and I talk to most of them quite regularly, but the thing that's intrigued me is how much better they've been at collecting cash, but also how much better they've been at managing that element, which when the good times come, it's important, but not top priority. But in times like now, many of them are saying to me, we've actually never been in better shape on that particular issue. And isn't that intriguing? The pandemic's driven some of those processes and efficiency, and clearly that's going to be hugely important for their success going forward into 2021 and beyond as well. So all of the things that we mentioned today, Richard, they resonate, and I'm seeing those not just in the UK, but actually right around the world. It's pretty consistent.
And I think the common theme to a lot of this is going to be the contribution of management. You know, whether you're preparing for the M&A deal, whether you are making sure that partners are out collecting cash, or whether you are making sure that behaviours being delivered to clients match those that the clients want. Dan, just from your point of view, because obviously you were talking to us a few minutes ago, what sort of have you learned some stuff today from what you're hearing from the other experts on the panel? What would you say?
So I absolutely have, and that's why these things are fascinating to me, because it's great to hear what's going on in other parts of the professional services world. Of course, my focus is on law firms largely, and seeing how they have reacted through the COVID crisis, and you see some real outstanding behaviours and practices, and others that perhaps focus so much on things like cash is king, but sometimes to the detriment of understanding where their client is at. So this is why I always say that there are two sides to that coin. Absolutely got to focus on this forecasting, focus on cash is king, but don't forget, particularly a great example you described at the moment. My business is going through a real trauma after what happened last week. Let's remember, our professional advisors need to be able to advise us, but also empathize with us as to what we're going through right now. And I think COVID has brought that to light. And one other final thing, Francesca, you mentioned and you mentioned T-shape, and I think that's exactly where the O-shape came from. And just to explain why, when I brought people in, we looked at the idea of the T-shaped professional, this ability to work across boundaries. And it was almost as a kind of side that I said, we want an all-rounder. And if we're looking at someone who's an all-rounder, that's alphabetically more O than T. And that's how this concept started. But yeah, fascinating to hear from people. Thank you.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the old balance scorecard, which I think most of us have probably seen. Which, again, making sure you're in all four quadrants, which again is very much around this sort of O. John, we talked a little bit about preparing firms and being ready for deals, and just give us some thoughts about the importance of management. There's a lot of managing partners obviously on the call today. I mean, where do you see their role as being important to investors?
Oh, well, I think they have the critical role, because I think, as Francesca was talking, it's all about the vision and the integration of the deal. And also it's then about process, because I think people can misunderstand M&A. To some extent, good M&A requires a lot of research, a lot of analysis. and a lot of, if you like, management forecasting and valuation skills. So I think the importance of central management when you're looking at M&A is critical. It's actually pulling together all the right advice so that they know what they're buying, how they're going to integrate it, and that they're going to be able to pay the right price for it that will generate value to their own shareholders.
And from the banking point of view, Nick, again, staying with management for a minute, or leadership, and I know the two aren't quite the same, but the people who are running the business, I mean, where would you as the banker, how do you look at management's contribution to the business?
I mean, it's at the forefront. I mean, any banker who's had extensive credit training will always be told that the biggest cause of failure for any business is management, and so we will focus on management, and in particular, we'll focus on management's ability to adapt to things like COVID, the ability for the firm as a whole to perhaps change partner agreements, to the partnership agreement, to change the approach to drawings, distributions, etc., so on, and also the ability of management to listen to finance in particular. When I joined the sector sort of 6 years ago, I was quite amazed about how little some finance directors, CFOs had in involvement that they had in the vision of the business, and that impact, I think, is key more than ever at the moment.
Oh, music for the finance directors' ears. I remember back in 2008, all of a sudden a bunch of finance directors said to me, because we had a group, and they said, "Oh, we're suddenly relevant. We suddenly got a job to do." I think they've stayed in there since then, but that was a bit of a revelation for them. Staying again with Francesca, but I mean, what do you think we've got an issue here which is different for larger firms and some of the smaller firms on the sector? I mean, you obviously have that perspective worth working for a big multinational, if you like, firm, but also individually many much smaller firms within individual countries. I mean, are these issues sort of, in your mind, equally pertinent for firms of all sizes?
There's a lot of commonality, I find. So if I look at firms that would classify as smaller within our network, some of the thematics coming from there you see in the larger member firms within our organisation as well. So there is a lot of commonality, and I think there's some of the things that really stood up is that how you deal with your own business in times of unbelievable change. How you handle that change, how your leadership team steps up. And there was a great question on the Q&A. Do you actually need to retool your leadership team? Of which the answer undoubtedly is they should be retooling all the time and evolving. So a lot of those issues are very common. And that whether you've got a small firm or a large firm, your clients are going to be varying between distressed sectors and not distressed sectors. So there's a real commonality there. But I think perhaps picking up on John's point around the corporatization, the larger you are as an organization, the more corporate you are. Individual partners have a say, but you're running a more corporate function. And that does provide some different levels, some more flexibility perhaps to do things. If you're, I've got just a couple of partners and you're much more exposed and your resources are more limited, that there are some challenging situations there around bandwidth. Because I think the thing that perhaps has struck me most has not been so much that people aren't doing great things, big or small, but the sheer intensity of the last few months. How do you make sure your own business is robust? How do you manage clients who are probably far more demanding than they've ever been because they're going through real challenges? And then how do you manage your own people? And the real challenge around that is they are in varying degrees of having either really coping well under stress or maybe not. You've got a lot of well-being issues with your own people. So I think leadership bandwidth has been a common focus. And how do you manage to make sure you take some of that weight off the shoulders of the top leadership to give them some space to think about the new normal as well? So I think the answer is probably a mix, Richard, of some of the bandwidth issues are perhaps more obvious in smaller firms, but I think everybody is dealing with some very common thematics about volatility, taking sensible precautions now for what we know may not be the end of this. We may have, it may be a U, it may be a W, who knows what it's going to be. Hopefully it's going to go back up. But I think a lot of people are still saying the end of this year, beginning of next year is crunch point. But depending on where the pandemic flows, if you can see yourself through that period of time and come out of it, well run, good shape, well thought through, take the lessons, then you're going to be set up very well for 2021. But I don't think anyone pretends that it's going to be plain sailing. And it's hugely important that people are investing the thinking time now to give themselves the ability to handle that in the most effective way.
Yeah, I was talking to, you may remember Rohit, who came on to our session a few weeks ago now and yesterday, and he was kind of saying that he's now finding, he had, if you recall, 4 scenarios, which were basically 2 associated with COVID and 2 associated with economic recovery. And when we did a poll, we found that people were kind of either seeing it as being all negative, all positive, but not much in between. And he's saying now that he's finding that actually people are now preparing for a world where the economic recovery is not good, and also COVID is still there. I mean, at the end of the day, we now know that 94% of people in the UK have yet to get COVID. Well, yet to, who knows, that's another story, but it may disappear. We may get vaccines, we just don't know. So I think, yeah, the thing that we haven't mentioned today, I'm interested in Dan's thought, is charters, because if I go back a few years now, a number of professional firms were kind of almost nailing a piece of paper to the wall and saying, these are the behaviors that we will guarantee to provide to our clients. And I did hear some people who said it actually was a great help to management, because a lot of the partners had nowhere to run if for whatever reason they failed to deliver against those promises. How does that concept fit in with the O-shaped lawyer, Dan, this idea of something, a public charter within the firm itself?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about charters as part of this, and some of the group regularly bring it back into the vernacular we have with firms. I think they work provided they can be monitored, measured, and then improvements made as a result. One of the concerns I have about words on a page is that that's all they are, and that by signing up to those words on a page, there's almost a feeling that that's job done. Actually, that's just the start. And if you are going to put something down like a charter, and those in the legal profession, some people might be aware of the Mindful Business Charter that's trying to create a much more healthy and well profession. They're brilliant concepts. They have fantastic meaning behind them. But unless you've got a way of measuring them, monitoring them, and then improving as a result, they'll just get put in the drawer as a bit of, we've done that, tick that box, let's move on to the next thing. So principle, yes, but they've got to be well looked after, supported, accounted for, and improvements made as a result.
Francesca, again, I'm thinking back, there were certainly a couple of incidents in the accountancy profession which kind of got into the media and led to various sort of changes, and charters and the like were some of the ways that firms felt that they would deal with them. I mean, do you have any thoughts on how you actually go beyond the here's some words on a page if you want to bring about behavior change?
Yeah, charters were incredibly popular, weren't they, for a while? I mean, the good old HMRC, Tax Authority, had their own charter. Many organisations put a charter out. And I think there's a touch of stake in the ground there to go, we want to show we're doing something about it. We want to acknowledge this. But the only way we can think of doing that is making sure there's a good professional statement out there, and that there was a whole plethora, and then some really great material in them too. But it's all about execution, isn't it? It's all very well having a charter, but how are you making sure you live up to it? How are you making sure you honour it? And I suppose you see that flow through into the many value statements that organisations have, whether they call them value statements or mission statements or some other terminology. And they're hugely important to set out your purpose and your strategic direction to go towards it, building the boat, where are you trying to head that boat to? But it's all about, are you actually living up to it? What's the consequence management if you don't? And it's about role modeling. If you have a charter that says we're going to do this, and the behaviors that people see don't align with that at all, be at whatever level, you've got an issue. And I always remember going many years ago to a talk by the Judge Business School in Cambridge. And they did lots of really, really great examples of situations where they would put up what people had said from an organisational point of view they wanted to do, and then the thing that had really happened that had filtered into the public knowledge. And it is all about that consistency approach and making sure that you make the tough decisions, when people aren't abiding by that, how do you ensure that you, if you say this is what you stand for, what do you do to make sure that you live up to it? And if you've got a rainmaker who's hugely important in your business in terms of bringing in great client work, but they don't live up to your values, the really, really strong firm is the firm that takes action against the rainmaker, despite the commercial sides of that. So I'm actually a bit of a fan of a charter in terms of a stake in the ground, but I'm a much bigger fan of making sure that you truly show that you're living up to it as well.
Yeah, when we did the inclusiveness poll, I don't remember that question that Shagan suggested, which was, are people sanctioned, senior management sanctioned for doing things which are seen to be inappropriate? And like half of them said, no, this would never happen. Well, the likelihood that any behavior change will happen in that state. John, just picking up this point that we're doing now around sort of stake in the ground, call it charter, whatever, but then actually the key thing being execution and the delivery. Now, how do you see investors in that space? I mean, they clearly get numbers, but numbers typically look backwards rather than forwards. We've heard from Nick that forecasts possibly aren't as sophisticated as they could be. So how do investors go about assessing the health and the morale of these firms that they're investing in?
Well, I think if you if you don't have reliable forward numbers, I think that's the point I was trying to make. It is trickier for investors because fundamentally valuations to most external investors are driven by the future values and the future cash flows of a business, not its historic cash flows. So I think the first point is if you don't have any ability to forecast your cash and forecast your sort of profitability and the returns you're going to get from an investment, life is tricky. There are proxies that you can use, but I think basically every single professional services company that we've raised money for have done so on the back of having good systems. And that's one of the things you put a lot of effort into to begin with when you're advising on an IPO and everything else, is making sure they've got adequate cash and forecasting systems. And also the other thing that I think is lost if you're not careful is that the ability to forecast your numbers is actually to look at the health of your business going forward in an empirical way, not in a way of like charters or something like that. It's actually a sort of a line in the sand where you can judge where you're expecting to be. And it comes back to one key, if you like, skill of management, which is typically for public companies, but is for any company, is management is forecasting how you're going to grow the value of the business. And you can only do that if you have got good forecasting skills and metrics and KPIs. So to me, I would look at a professional services firm first as, well, what are your 6 key KPIs? I'm less worried about charters and all of these sorts of things, and I would expect one of those KPIs to be cash or some sort of proxy for cash as to how you would do that. So I think the key messaging is financials and financial forecasting, not historics, are key to establishing the value and therefore the value that investors will put on a business.
Well, thank you, John. I think ending with that, I mean, the key point to me there is that, yes, the professional services firm that is preparing for an IPO will go through that very detailed scrutiny by John and his colleagues and others. But why wait for the IPO and the investor when it's actually just good management practice? And the best businesses, whether they're privately owned or whether they've got investors, run in the same way. So good for all of us to hear that. Right, we're now kind of getting to the point where I want to thank the panel hugely for their, as usual, very insightful way of telling us all about what their views are on a whole range of issues. If you recall, we looked at what clients view, we looked at the M&A funding, and we also looked at the financial health. And I think we all learned a lot from today, which is great. For those of you who aren't aware, you can find every video in the management library, so there's the link there. Now, for those of that can join us, the link is there. It's also in the chat, so if you want to check out the chat, you can open up there, live.rema.co.uk, retuning your firm. And I think that's looking forward to seeing you there, whether it's a table of 2, a table of 4, or a table of 6. You can go and find people and have a nice quick chat. And as I said, it's something that we are going to be launching next week for all the members so that they can, this is almost like their private club where they can go in and catch up with friends and talk about the things that keep them awake at night. So thank you for that. And thank you. I hope you all enjoyed, hope you found today valuable. Please encourage your peers to sign up at the usual link, and hopefully see some of you shortly in the member lounge. Otherwise, thanks again to the team, to the panel. Really good, interesting session today. Apart from that, I shall wish you all a fantastic day and a great weekend when you get there. Bye for now.